Today I've been asked to talk to you about positive deviance. This is an approach that's been used in healthcare for about 20 years and is just starting to be used in education. So Tisa asked me to come in and tell you a little bit about that, tell you a little bit about the experiences that I've had working with positive deviance, and also take you through sort of some thinking, get you guys thinking about how this approach, how this methodology may be applied to your field and what you're working on today. And I've read a little bit, some of the background information for your program. I'm not an expert in it, but I'm sure I'll learn, and hopefully you'll learn some from me. So with that, let me start by asking, has anybody ever heard of positive deviance? Just a couple. Okay, good. Thank you, Tisa. So let me start with a bit of a story. We're going to go back about 20 years and go to Vietnam. Has anybody been to Vietnam? Ooh. Oh, good. We got one. So we're going to go back about 20 years to the early 1990s in Vietnam. These are the Sternons, Monique and Jerry Sternon. They arrived in Vietnam as the country directors for Save the Children. So their task was to improve the health and well-being of children in Vietnam. They arrived, and they were there in part because there were very high rates of malnutrition in Vietnam at the time. So they arrived, and as Monique tells this story, and I would encourage you to, once we're done with this another time, go and watch Monique's TED Talk that she gives on this topic. She really tells some great stories about her arrival in Vietnam and sort of the ultimatum that the government gave she and Jerry to not only be there and work on malnutrition, but they said, we're the government, you have 6 months, you have a 6-month visa to solve malnutrition in Vietnam. So they were afraid of this. They sort of thought about it. They came from Tufts University. That's where they did a lot of their studies. And at Tufts, a woman named Marion Zeitlin had been working with a concept called positive deviance. Positive deviance has been around since the early 60s, but really never sort of grabbed hold. People really didn't know how to use it. So we're going to talk about what it is and how it might be applicable to what you're doing. So this is sort of what they saw when they arrived. But as they were walking around the villages and sort of looking and talking, they sort of observed really first that even in some of these very, very poor villages, there were always a few children that were growing well. So everybody's poor, all the families have a lack of food, but there was always these couple of households that somehow seemed to be raising their children who were healthy. So what they did is they did surveys, gathered data. I understand we've got a couple of data heads here, which is great. I'm an epidemiologist, so I like data. And they gathered data on the children, they weighed and measured them, and in essence found the households where, even though they were poor, the children were growing well. And these are referred to then as the positive deviant households. If you think about a bell curve, these are the families, and we'll see a couple of bell curves today, these are the families whose children were growing well in spite of the fact that they had a lack of resources. So what they did is they decided to try and figure out what were the reasons? What were the reasons that these children were growing well even though the families had the same limited resources as everyone else? So what they did is what are called now, and you'll hear me refer to them through the talk, positive deviant inquiries. So they selected maybe 8 or 10 families, not a big number, not a random sample, not even a big sample. But they went and really spent a lot of time, very in-depth conversations with these positive deviant households. And what they found, at least in some of the households they were originally working with, is that through their conversations, not just conversations, but very importantly, observations, which I understand is a big topic of conversation here, through observation, they observed that as the women, mostly women, were working in the rice fields, in the wet rice fields, shrimp and crabs would scurry by. And the women would plant, and then they would scoop up and put these shrimp and crabs in their pocket and take them home, cook them up, and give them to their children. Ta-da! So what they observed was that these, and they talked to the women about this, they talked to the families about it, and it turned out that not only were the families sort of aware that this was so good for their children, but they were sort of embarrassed by it. They were sort of like, well, we didn't talk about it much because we're so poor, we have to essentially scavenge from the ground. Shrimp and crabs and greens. Well, we know, and you would know, that giving kids shrimp and crab is a great thing for their nutrition and really made a huge difference. So what the students did is they had further conversations, confirmed that this was one of the important factors with helping these children grow well, and then used these people as mentors. So these people then were encouraged, essentially, that they were doing something really well. And then they talked to their colleagues and friends in the neighborhood, and then this led to further sort of development of scaling up of these habits. So what would be a way to scale up shrimp and crabs? Small entrepreneurs started raising shrimp farms, crab farms, and they started really sort of building this out. There were a couple other behaviors that were identified. Family members added greens of sweet potato plants to the children's meals. PD families gave smaller meals more often, which is a good thing to do with little kids. So there are just a very limited set of easy behaviors, no-cost behaviors. So this wasn't a big intervention. Care, say that children weren't delivering big amounts of food. There wasn't logistics involved. Everything had been discovered from within the community. So that's another really important point when we look at sort of what are the things that make something a positive deviant sort of program and approach. These are things that are discovered from within the community, within the organization, and they're sort of already there. You're not sort of throwing things at it all the time. So how did I meet the Sternans? I met the Sternans because I knew them from some time that I had spent in Indonesia. I had been in Indonesia some years before and hooked up with David Marsh. And this is really for Tiza, so she can see the picture of me at my 23rd birthday party in Indonesia. I'm the one in the middle. Every time I show this, it looks further from what I look like now, which is really scary and sad. But anyway, I lived about 5 years in Indonesia and learned sort of about these kinds of things there and worked in Southeast Asia. So I was brought in while I was at Emory with the head of global health for Save the Children to write a grant to really do a scientific study of this positive deviance initiative. Sort of lots of observation, well, does it really work? So we got a grant from USAID, and we actually, pretty large grant, about a $500,000 something grant, and we actually randomized whole communities to this positive deviance approach or sort of standard care, the comparison communities. We did lowland, we did sort of middle, and then we did highland communities to make sure that it worked at all different sort of elevations. And then we followed people for a couple of years, followed the families and followed the kids, and looked at really how this approach of measuring the kids, finding the families whose kids were growing well, finding out what those families were doing differently, and then replicating that, would work on a large scale. So another thing I want to point out here, and this is going to create a little tension, is that positive deviance, so the behaviors and the insights, are pretty local. So you can imagine that shrimp and crabs maybe weren't the key things in the mountains, right? Something a little different were the key things in the mountains. Maybe shrimp was, but something else wasn't. So this wasn't just taking the shrimp and crabs and then writing a manual, like lots of people do, and sending it out and saying, okay, everybody eats shrimp, crabs, and greens, gets to the mountains, people don't have shrimp, crabs, and greens. So this is this tension between sort of standardization and local sort of input into things like observation matrices and rubrics, right? So I think there's some analogies there. So we followed these kids, and what was really exciting is that not only children who were newly born during the program grew taller and better, but say the children actually pulled out. I sent some Emory Masters in Public Health students back into Vietnam a few years later, and in the villages where this program had happened, the children who hadn't even been born yet, so the younger siblings of the families, were actually also growing better. So this really gave some evidence for these are sustainable and sustained behaviors, in part because they're behaviors. They're not relying on donations or anything like that. Okay, so that's the origin story really for positive deviance. And as you read about it, you'll hear a lot about Vietnam, you'll hear a lot about the malnutrition story. This really then has led to a lot of different applications of positive deviance. I guess I've got in my bag there, but we wrote essentially a supplement to the Food and Nutrition Bulletin a few years ago. So included in this was the documentation of the Vietnam project, but also looking at positive deviance in Malawi with breastfeeding. It's now been applied to a number of very difficult sort of areas, like keeping females in school in countries where they usually drop out of school in 3rd grade. Malaria, I was recently involved in a project where we used positive deviance to attempt, we didn't succeed yet, eradicate polio in Pakistan. So very difficult, very challenging sort of areas is when you want to be thinking, okay, we need something that's new and different to try and deal with this. Okay, so that's the first sort of example I want to share with you. Now I want to tell you I want to structure a little bit more. What is positive deviance, and what are sort of the key steps? And then I'm going to give you a second example that I led with Hispanic diabetics, so you can see sort of more in depth how this really works. So the concept of positive deviance, this is sort of what I've said, but this is sort of the important definition. In every community, there are certain individuals or groups whose uncommon behaviors, uncommon is a key word, or strategies enable them to find better solutions to a problem than their peers, while facing similar challenges and constraints and having access to the same resources. Okay? So we're not looking for common activities, common behaviors, we're looking for things that are different. And that's part of the challenge, and we'll talk about how we do that. So again, this is the concept that in any population, community, group, school, district, there are going to be certain people or teachers or observers that are doing things a little bit better or different than everybody else. And the questions are, how do they do it? And a lot of the question that I've started to look at, and we'll talk about it when we get to the diabetes, is why and the motivation. So it's not just sort of the activity, but also the mental sort of state of mind that's leading people to do things differently. So to compare sort of the traditional approach to a lot of things, interventions, problem-solving approach, and the positive deviance one, the traditional one is generally externally funded by experts, very top-down, outside in. Lots of look at deficit. We're looking sort of who's malnourished, who's doing the things wrong, who's dropping out. What's wrong here begins with analysis of the underlying causes of the problem. It's a sort of medical approach to things. And then also, we'll talk about this here, by being outside in, the recipients, the beneficiaries, I don't want that, I don't think I need that, where did it come from? I wasn't a part of the solution. So this is, is this resonating? So this sort of immune system defense, and in global health and interventional health, we have a lot of this as well. So the positive deviance approach attempts really to sort of counterbalance all of those things. That really a very important part of the process, and you didn't get it much yet from the Vietnam project, is that this is a collaborative effort, that the community really was a part of identifying what these behaviors were. It wasn't a bunch of epidemiologists or a bunch of people sort of taking notes and then, okay, here's the thing. This is talking with people, figuring it out among themselves, being a part of the discovery. So there's this discovery phase that's really integral to positive deviance. It's very down up, inside out, it's asset based. So we go in, we say, okay, there's a lot of good stuff going on here. Instead of, you guys are dropping the ball, nothing's working, it's a mess. It really focuses on what's going right. It begins with analysis of successful solutions. So right from the beginning, the conversation's about, is there anybody, and this is a sort of classic question, here's the problem, here's what's not happening right, is there anybody who's doing it the way we would like? Or is there anybody who's got, sort of the outcome we're looking for? Are there any schools where 99% of the teachers aren't above average. Might be an example. So is there anybody that's giving some sort of distribution to that? If there is, what's different about them? How did they come to choose to say, oh, it's okay to not have everybody be Lake Wobegon? Is that everybody's above average? So those are we'll talk more about that. Solution space, and again, bypasses this immune system sort of response by having it come from within. A couple other sort of attributes of positive deviance that I don't know if they're all necessary, but a lot of them are important. Again, community ownership, and community I'm using to mean, again, school district. I mean, community can be a lot of different things. There is an appreciation of the fact that this is possible because here are people just like them who've succeeded. So these are, wow, I didn't know that person who lives in a less well-off house than I do, was doing the right thing. The process that we'll talk about actually is part of the behavior change, and I'll give you a couple examples of that. There is a monitoring and evaluation process. It's not always sort of super sophisticated, but it's very participatory, and it's very much a part of what's going on in the process. Again, self-identifying, part of the discovery. So what are the four? As you read the literature, you'll come across 4 steps, 5 steps, 6 steps. There's sort of between 4 and 6 steps, and I think I've got a handout here. So the classic steps, I think Jerry Sternin called them the 5 Ds. The first is to define the problem. So what is the problem? I'll just use Vietnam, so we've only seen one. The problem was what? Malnutrition. Pretty straightforward, inadequate growth on the part of children. Determine the presence of the positive deviant individuals. So how did they do that in Vietnam? So they did a survey, and they said, okay, our indication of positive deviance is going to be a well-growing child. They could have used something different. They could have said, well, maybe it's mom's feeding in some way, or maybe it's something else. But they defined that, and that's really important because that's what you're sort of then measuring and finding your distribution from. Then they went through the inquiries, discovered the uncommon behaviors and strategies, designed and developed the initiatives, leveraging everybody who's part of the community. And this was particularly important in the scale-up because we said, okay, shrimps and crabs, what are ways that we could have more shrimps and crabs for everybody to eat? And that was discussions among the community. That wasn't, Unilever coming in with shrimp and crab. That was something that was developed from within. And then measurement is important. So one of the things that Monique talks a lot about when we talk about positive deviance is that, we're using this in really what, some people would say impossible, really difficult problems. So I want you to know as you get into this that, there's been there's great stories of success with things, really tough stuff. Very deep-seated traditional beliefs, female genital mutilation in Middle Eastern countries. Very tough stuff. We've got just a small percentage of the population that is doing the right thing, and then figuring out why and how they're doing the right thing, and then scaling that up throughout the population. Go where things have failed. So what are some of the challenges of the Positive Deviance Initiative? It's not a magic bullet. Some challenges is that it's paradigm shift for practitioners. In part, this is not as controlled as probably a lot of us in the room, including myself, would like. That there's going to be some messiness and fuzziness in going through the process. Scaling up strategies tend to be difficult. It's quite labor intensive. There's a lot of people time. Requires discomfort with certain uncertainties, and certain funders would say, well, this is fuzzy, where are my outcomes, make sure I'm going to get A and B. There are funding organizations that do fund this, including Gates has got a project in education right now that I'll talk a little bit about. And it takes some skills in figuring this stuff out, because especially in the analysis, when you go through the process, and I'll show some examples, you get a lot of information, you get a lot of potential behaviors. Among the shrimp and crabs and greens were a whole bunch of other stuff, and figuring out which were the ones that were really responsible for the growth is difficult.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the scaling up strategies?
Sure. So let me give you a second example here in a second, but in the health examples, frequently it is, identifying with a couple of communities and then scaling that up first within the community. So those things are discovered then within a community or two. And then one of the ways that's been successful is inviting other community leaders to sort of see. So if these are villages or schools, inviting people over, then they sort of see what's going on. And what they generally do is, or what works the best is they see the process, see the successes, and then they go back, and they really have to go back, they have to go through the process themselves. So the scale up involves sort of replicating this process, and it can be condensed. So in the living universities in Vietnam, the first sort of whole process, if it took 2 months, then in subsequent villages, maybe it took 2 weeks, because there's this sort of knowledge base that's being built on. So I want to give you another example, and then we're going to talk some about education. So let's see, we'd done Vietnam, we'd published the manuscript, and then I had started working with Educator, and I got a call, sitting in my office and got a call from a healthcare consultant in Texas. And he said, "Dirk, we've got an emergency." I said, "An emergency?" So this is a benefits consultant, and what kind of emergency could this be? But anyway, he said, "We've got an emergency. We're having a big meeting in San Antonio, Texas next week, and we'd like you to be there." So the emergency was that he worked for a big supermarket chain, H-E-B. It's sort of like Kroger or Publix, depending on where you're from. 65,000 employees. Their health plan was Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas. And their problem, the emergency, was that about 60% of the employees at H-E-B are Hispanic. And a very large number of them, like lots of Hispanics unfortunately, were overweight and had diabetes or pre-diabetes. So this was a self-insured, Blue Cross of Texas was was a TPA, but they were self-managed. So during this day, the VP of Health Benefits, I guess, at H-E-B, literally looked to me and said, "Dirk, we're a 100-year-old company. We're a billion-dollar company. We've been around forever, and every year more and more of our employees get diabetes, and if we don't get a handle on this, we're going to go out of business." I mean, she literally said, "We're going to go out of business if we don't start pushing down the costs associated with diabetes among their employees." And the problem is that they had everything in Spanish, they had health and wellness programs, but nobody was signing up. Nobody was using them. So it was a quandary. Why wasn't anybody using them? And what were we going to do? You may know diabetes among Hispanics is about not quite double, but it's getting close. So it's a big problem, very costly. This was costing the company something like $150 million a year just for this one condition. So what did I think about? Positive deviance. I thought, well, there's lots of employees, not 65,000 employees, big number of people. There must be a few of these Hispanic employees that are doing the right thing, that are managing their condition, that are not costing the company a lot of money. So we proposed this. We got some money from Blue Cross of Texas, H-E-B, and actually Merck threw in a couple $100,000. So we were able to do a very in-depth, sort of broad-scale positive deviance analysis or approach with these Hispanic diabetics. So this is the distribution. Importantly, as you see up here, we wanted to look at the lower salaried employees. I didn't want to talk to the executive who happened to be Hispanic that had a membership to Gold's Gym and ate organic whatever. We wanted to talk with the women and men that are cutting the fruit and driving the trucks. How do they figure it out? Who are they? So that's what we did. We got a bunch of records. I'll talk to you about how we got them. And we said, here are all the employees. We're going to look at the Hispanic employees with the low salaries. We cut it off at $29,000 a year. Most of these have poor diabetes management. We want to find these guys. And You can't walk into HEB and find those guys. You just don't see them. Well, let me talk about the objectives first. So the objective here was to gain a deeper understanding of Hispanic diabetics, especially in regards to their motivation. So I really wanted to understand not just their behaviors, but sort of how did they get to that point? How did they get to the point of saying, yeah, I'm going to take care of myself and I'm going to do a better job? And then what are their strategies and tactics? So what's the equivalent then of doing the survey and weighing the kids? That's what we're looking for, right? Doing the survey, weighing the kids. We had to come up with something that would indicate good diabetes management behaviors. So for the data geeks in the crowd, it's very exciting. We convinced the employer, the health plan, the disease management vendor, and the wellness vendor to give us their data sets. We had 5 unique IDs, merged them all together, and then ended up and looked at things like foot screenings, if you're familiar with diabetes, eye screenings, foot screenings, intent to lose weight, doctor's visits. So we came up with 42 indicators. People got 0, 1. We didn't make it too complicated. We added them all up. We ranked everybody. The folks at the top were the positive deviants. Low income, high positive deviant self-management scores. So we recruited 78 Hispanics, and we did in-depth interviews, in-depth focus groups to try and understand what their behaviors were. And I'm going to show you, hopefully it'll work. I'm going to show you an example of that. We recorded all of the interviews, generated 2,000 pages of text in English and Spanish, and then used qualitative analytical software, Max QDA. We coded everything, and I'll show you some coding. So this is a video of one of the participants, one of the positive deviant Hispanic diabetics. And hopefully the sound will be good enough. But the focus group moderator is asking people, what motivated you to take charge of your diabetes? Was there a moment? Was there an activity?
A moment when you have felt the most motivated to take care of diabetes. If you can remember just a moment in your life when you said, okay, this is it. Now I'm going to start taking care of it. What could you tell me?
The first thing that came to my mind was I found out that they actually pay you to go to diabetic study. And you know, when I went to the diabetic blinders clinic and they said, well, you can do this and do this, you know, and we're going to test you for this medication and stuff. I mean, they were very well organized, they were very knowledgeable, and I guess that really got me, you know what? And sure enough, at the end of the study, my diabetes were controlled there. And I don't know what it is. I mean, this is an illness or something. But, you know, I think to me the fact that we have a whole team trying to help you like that, it just makes you feel good, like, wow, you know, my body's working, I'm sure it's important, instead of like just me trying to do something. So.
What about you?
Yeah, this girl, way back, my dad was in the was told, so I don't want to do like that. It was good. They say, you know, told, but, you know, they were very delicate on my feet. So, what I want to be is like, you don't want to be, I want to be like,
I don't know if you can hear that. His father was going to lose his child.
That was it.
yes.
Okay.
He said the birth of my child.
What you said?
Well, tell me, this doctor.
This is the one I want you to hear.
He says, can you go back tomorrow? He says, after I have this message today, can you go back tomorrow and show you something? I says, okay. And I was already diabetic. And I wasn't taking care of myself the very first year. Let me show you something. Why don't you go with me? So we went out to the Southside. Went out to this Southwest hospital. And so it was the wound center. Okay, and he says, they were just beginning over there, then, and this old doctor from Puerto Rico, he says, I'm going to take you to 2 rooms. He says, okay. This is the first stage. People have across the fingers. since then. I've always taken it serious, especially this.
Okay, thank you.
When I saw that, I thought, wow, this is, first of all, it's so clear. You know, here's a doctor who's taking care of this. He's had diabetes forever. He makes a decision to put on his jacket, walk him across the street out of his office, take a few extra minutes, and say, sit here for an hour, and he changed this guy's life. I mean, just sit here an hour, spend some time with these people who are, you know, a few years ahead of you, and it changed his life. So I don't know if you heard him say it. So one of the words that we heard a lot was the word serious, right? He said, now I take it serious. Now I take it serious. And I'm going to show you the results, but that word kept popping up, that this is serious. This is not just a little sugar. This isn't something that Aunt Rosa had and everybody has. This is something that's serious. The other thing is, when we're looking at these, we're looking at things, you asked about scalability, you know, that story, what are some, as I go through the rest of it, think about ways to sort of take that story and scale it. Okay, so let me go through the rest. So we got interviews like that, hundreds of hours of interviews, coded it all according to these themes: motivation, diabetes education, management, diet, exercise. Motivation, for example, we coded, they were motivated because it made them feel better. They were motivated because they thought it would be good for their family. They didn't want to take medicines. So there are different types of motivations, different sort of subcodes. And then we ranked these, and I think pretty clever. I'm not sure I came up with it, but somebody in our group did. We said, let's not just look at the frequency of the mentions of these things, but let's also look at the passion with which someone says them. So this is, oh yeah, well, it's my diet. And they said, no, my diet. That was the key thing. You know, there's sort of a intensity, and these are Latin, so everybody's throwing arms around, and it's great. So anyway, it was fun. A lot of time to code it, so this is not simple. So then we took all of that and we analyzed it and simplified it to these things. We said, okay, what motivates you to prevent or control your diabetes? High frequency, high passion, prevent complications, like you heard in the group that we saw. Importance of family, and I'm going to talk about sort of how these broke out. We actually came up with some archetypes, so I'm going to talk about that. Feeling better, religion, fewer medications. So as an outsider, we might think, oh, you know, we're going to write a whole bunch of stuff because if you take care of your diabetes, you're going to take less medicines, and you're going to go to the doctor less. This would say that wouldn't work very well, right? Because that's sort of at the bottom. That isn't going to get people off the couch. But by doing this and getting people motivated through this, then we know that they will take less medications and have fewer doctor visits. So the other thing is sort of this concept of fear that we had long conversations about sort of, why don't you think, you're taking care of your diabetes, why don't you think the person in the checkout stand or, you know, cutting the fruit next to you is? And they would mostly say because they don't understand how serious it is, and they sort of aren't afraid enough. Sort of seriousness and fear went together. And they were mainly afraid of amputation, like you heard, blindness, and some of these other things. So the fear thing is hard because we know that that's what motivated them. In a lot of public health and education, sort of the use of fear is controversial, right? You've heard, you know, you've graphic images and smoking and the stuff in New York and on the subways. So there's a lot of sort of back and forth about how much of this fear to use in terms of changing behavior. We can talk about that a little bit. Okay, so then we had also, those were sort of the motivators, and then we also had tactics. So this is the equivalent of the shrimp, crabs, and greens. And diet, you know, we're looking for things, a lot of stuff comes out, but we're looking for things that are very simple, very easy. One guy in a conversation just like that, they said, well, how do you manage your diet? He said, I don't eat white. Like, what do you mean by that? I don't eat white. I don't eat rice, white potatoes, white bread. I just don't eat white. I thought, wow, that's really, gets it right down. I mean, if you sort of white sugar, you cut out white, that's pretty good. So this guy in 3 words came up with, we've spent $1 billion creating food pyramids and everything. This guy making $24,000 driving a truck came up with don't eat white, and I think I'm going to patent it or something and give him the royalties. So that's what you're looking for. Something simple, clear, easy. All of you will remember don't eat white, I'm sure, because it's so simple to remember. The other was exercise, not complicated. Most people took walks while they're 20 minutes. They took a walk with a friend, talked about the telenovelas, took a walk around. And having an exercise partner also rose to the top. So these are the things that are rising to the top. The other thing that I think is really important hadn't come out in earlier work that came out here was we ended up determining that there wasn't just one type of positive deviant Hispanic diabetic. There wasn't like just one cookie cutter, everybody's the same. We actually identified 7 archetypes of different motivators, different types of people. So one was what we call the caretaker. So these happen to be usually women, cook food for others. They're really interesting because none of it's about themselves. It's all about their family. It's all about their kids. And when if you're an educator and you're aren't you afraid of dying? Aren't you afraid of? No, I'm not afraid. If I get my foot amputated, that means my husband, I can't drive my husband to work. It's not about their foot. Very selfless. So the messaging around that, of course, would have to align with it. The realists are mostly men. They use terms like take the bull by the horns, play the hand they're dealt, make the best of the situation. Then we actually had what we call the teacher leader. These people were, I've got diabetes and I'm going to teach everybody about diabetes. I mean, they were out there teaching classes, and that's sort of how they managed it. Social butterfly, young parent, pretty woman. So this was all about sort of the personal sort of look. And then a couple guys were what we called the soldiers who, really sort of, there was a war. They had a personal war on making sure diabetes didn't get them. So what do you do with all that? What we did was developed a sort of intervention, a sort of concept intervention that was called It's Time to Take It Serious. It included a hard copy handbook, in-store support groups, walking buddies program. Actually, when I first presented this, I had a kit, and I think we've got it here. Here are all the different pieces. And I had a kit, and I went to my cupboard, and I got my label maker, and I put a label on it that said, don't eat white. Stuck it on there. So I said, we're going to make plates that say, don't eat white. T-shirts, walking buddy T-shirts. There's 5 things, but all 5 things done together, end up making a difference. So this was then rolled out, scaled back out into HEB and their other employees. So that's health. I'm sharing health because it's my background, but also the sort of health applications of positive deviance are significantly more sort of developed. It's now starting to be used in education. I wanted to point this out. There's been a program called the Positive Deviance Initiative at Tufts. It's now on hiatus a little bit. They're having some funding issues. But the website's still up, and they've got a project by sector here, education. And they've got a number of areas that positive deviance has been applied to education. Education in Denmark. A lot of this is international. I think we've got Argentina. And the one I would direct you to is this one, Positive Deviant Voices, which is a positive deviance project, I think in New York, with minority high schoolers who are dropping out. And they've got a number of really sort of cool videos. We don't have time to look at them now, but I would encourage you. So these, they found kids, very low income, who would have been likely to drop out kids who were excelling in school above their peers. They got them together. They did positive deviance inquiry with them. They identified, I think, about 6 behaviors that seem simple again, going to bed early, coming prepared to class, a couple of these things. But what's neat about it is there's a video there of them, the kids, that the teenagers put together on, sort of what this means to not be positive deviant, what it is to be positive deviant, and they've got a rap song, so they're walking through, Harlem, singing this rap song about positive deviant voices. So it's a good example, I think, of sort of at least one application to health. And that's sort of here, and there's got an article that I'll leave you with as well. The other one, and it seems to be sort of applied to things like high school graduation rates. That's sort of a lot of where it's been applied so far. And the other one in Merced that's pretty well developed that I would direct you to as well. So in these, the process for the high school designed to address the pervasive challenges of high school dropouts, identify positive deviants who are students at risk for dropping out, but persisted, uncovering their uncommon strategies through inquiry and observation, creating an action plan to disseminate and discover behaviors to others at-risk students. So the same process that we've talked about. Arvind, who's a colleague, has a chapter I'll leave with, he says, well, and this sort of summarizes these different educations. I think one of the things that some people are struggling with as we adapt this to other areas is a positive deviant organization versus like a family or an individual. So I gave you a family example, I gave you an individual example. There is a positive deviant project going on with Long Beach School District. I don't know if people no, you guys are from here. And I talked with, there's another organization called Plexus Institute that's doing a lot of this work. I talked with Jeff, who's the CEO, yesterday, and basically said part of the challenge in working in like a school is that there are just so many things going on, right? I mean, family you sort of can observe, but just as you were saying, there's a lot of stuff going on and a lot of competing demands for people's time and all the things you guys struggle with on a daily basis. So what I wanted to do here in my last few minutes was just sort of take you through this grid, and I'm going to step over here. So this is the way when I'm working with students, I've worked with students over the years and others, that I sort of like to organize things. So these are the Vietnam and Texas examples. We've got what the problem is, what's Vietnam, child nutrition, desired outcome is well-nourished growing children, what's the context, these are rural villages, what's the unit of analysis, or what's the unit of the PD-ness? In this case, it's the families, the PD, and others, the employee. How do you find them? What's your measure? Positive deviants are people, poor families whose children are growing well, and then you can only get to here. So the thing I wanted to do for a few minutes is to see if we could get to here with one of your challenges. So 2 minutes. This is sort of fun. I think it's kind of fun. Hopefully the audio will be good enough. So the positive deviance is a approach, we'll call it a movement. I mean, there is now sort of some momentum getting going. It's been used in the field. You're not the first ones. You won't be the first ones to use it. But I'm hoping that from this you'll be some of the first followers. And you'll see what I mean by that here in a second. So this is a short video. I think it's 2.5 minutes on how to start a movement. So I can't take credit for being the lone nut. I'll give that to Jerry Sternin. But anyway, enjoyed spending some time with you guys, and I'll be around, I think, for whatever's next. Sure. Sure.